All right, CHistrue. This is part two of my honest dialogue between religion and science. And I think I'm going to probably make a bit of a series out of this, but I want to get to where I think there are some misconceptions on both sides. In part one, I discussed a lot of the misconceptions on the that religious conservatives will make against people on the left, calling people on the left ethical relativists, when in fact the actual history of left-wing thought is that's quite the contrary. The whole idea of an ideal social organization that transcends nation and culture would have been supported by people on the left and opposed by traditional conservatives of the Burkean mode. Traditional conservatives were the ones who actually, and maybe somewhat correctly, advanced the idea that social change needs to respect existing cultures and existing traditional mores. I wouldn't necessarily say that all truth is on one side or the other, but definitely if you're going to defend a Burkean understanding of social change, you shouldn't be in the business of attacking all forms of ethical relativism. And so quite the contrary, if you actually look at the history of left-wing thought, in many ways it would err on the side of absolutism. The Jacobins in France did not believe in a notion of the social good that would have derived from the traditional monarchist or Roman Catholic understanding of French society. So it may be in the case of Darwin that his English background meant that he was somewhat more ethically relativist than continental philosophers or continental scientists, but if anything, I would think that conservatives would like him more. I mean, he was more perhaps congenial, more tolerant, more less likely to foam at the mouth against religion than many of the continental philosophers. But more to the point, I think that the general idea of erecting a straw man and stating, aha, my opponents believe in ethical relativism, when in fact that they don't, I think is unhelpful. I also then launched into a criticism of where I believe that the arguments made by scientific thinkers against religion are also unhelpful and don't actually do justice to what religion is. For one thing, religion is a social construction. There is no one thing called religion that is separate from what society deems as religion. There are whole cultures where there actually is no separation between the religion and the society. Indigenous cultures would not notice such a separation. To talk about religion would be to talk about the mystics, and it would be to talk about the fanatics who burned them at the stake. It would also be to talk about the early scientists, all of whom had some conception that they were studying the natural world to learn God's order. That would mean Kepler, that would mean Copernicus, that would mean Faraday, and that would actually mean Newton, and it would actually mean Darwin himself to a certain extent, although he may have gone back and forth in that understanding. Obviously, in the case of the scientific forms of deism, there was not either there was not a belief in miracles, or there was a gradual downplaying of the concept of miracles as science developed, because by definition, if you're going to construct a notion of the natural world obeying certain laws, you're going to want those laws to cover more and more of it, and you're going to want something outside of those laws to cover less and less of it. But at no point did classical science, and at no point really does modern science rule out the concept of the divine. Remember that Einstein also was something of a deist, probably, you might say. And then when you got to quantum physics, you have all manner of spiritual beliefs, from Eastern mysticism to David Bohm to, I think that there are some mathematicians like Cantor or Gödel who went way out there on a limb too. So, those crazy guys going off on set theory and the continuum hypothesis, you got to watch out for those, right? Wink, wink, nod, nod. So I think that I then left off in part one with a discussion of the difference between dominant societal narratives, which may well have their origins either in a social construction, or else in perhaps some kind of evolutionary biology explanation for that, why we might believe in the wind as a personified force or something like that. I can accept that that's possible. I can accept that the argument that the reason that arose is because of some kind of survival need on the savannah. I could accept maybe that that's possible. I could also accept that maybe the reason societies have common shared narratives is to survive as a group. I could accept that there is a level of explanation where maybe that is true. What I cannot accept is the elevation of a truth into the one and only truth. In other words, evolutionary psychology may have a truth, but I do not believe that it is the one and only truth, because for me to accept, first of all, even the Goldians would talk about the idea of spandrels that maybe had a survival value at one point, but then the whole reason for their existence has mutated at some point to where the spandrel itself starts to define the environment, not the environment, the spandrel. I mean, that obviously gets into some deep evolutionary biology. But the point I'm trying to say is that when the concept of the divine, you can say that maybe it emerged from the bottom up through evolution, but the Teilhard de Chardin mode of understanding evolution would also posit that exactly as that's happening is exactly as the divine is incarnating into the physical. In other words, that what we call evolution on one level may be SB, natural selection, sexual selection, mutation, yada yada, and that's entirely accurate scientifically. But to say that explains spiritual consciousness might beg the question of, does that give rise to spiritual consciousness, or does spiritual consciousness give rise to all of that as a mode of bringing about spiritual consciousness? Again, as I stated at the end of part one, there's a big difference between the exoteric or the dominant societal narratives and the experiences of people on the mystical ends of the spectrum. The people on the mystical ends of the spectrum would talk about cosmic consciousness. I think I said this in part one, but if I didn't, I'm going to say it now, okay? They would talk about cosmic consciousness. They would talk about ideas of oneness. They would talk about ideas of surrendering the ego to the divine. I don't know that these have survival value on the savannah. And if they did have survival value on the savannah, I don't know that that would necessarily mean that they are not objective reality. Generally, when evolutionary biologists talk about survival value on the savannah, they talk about survival adaptations to an actually existing phenomenon. So if you're going to suggest that religion arose as a survival value, then are you not possibly suggesting that it arose as a response to an actually existing phenomenon? Remember that evolutionary biology has been enhanced by, not just by Darwin, but by Margulis, by Kropotkin, by, dare I mention Bergson? Probably not. I better not go that far. You'll definitely thumb it down at that point. But it has been enhanced by people who have gone beyond the Victorian model of understanding. Even though in its formal basis it still calls itself Darwinian, as it should, because Darwin was the thinker who, and should be rightly be credited as the naturalist who came up with the mechanism of best fit. And I would never take that away from him. But you will notice that even Alfred Russel Wallace, who also came up with natural selection, wasn't so sure that you could simply dismiss the evolution of humanity as being a simple matter of adaptationism and survival. He had a differing perspective on that. But I'm going to end part two by stating that I think there needs to be an honest dialogue that gets beyond Kent Hovind, that gets beyond Christopher Hitchens, that gets beyond simplistic ideas. And maybe in future videos I will try to engage in that. For now, I think I'm done with parts one and part two. CHistrue.